So what's up, Hog Pods? Thanks for tuning in to Hognose 1. So it's been a little bit since I've hopped on here. Been a busy year, been an awesome year. Had a chance to field collect a little bit this year. Get some new localities to work. I really like breeding those out and seeing if there's any aberrant animals, maybe if there's any other recessive traits, any dominant traits, any poly traits that, exist in certain wild bloodlines. It's definitely a labor of love. Takes some time to prove things out, but it's always something, kind of fun to do. Got some eggs this year from one of the girls that I picked up. She bred another male I had picked up. The localities are a little bit apart from one another, but I think it's close enough that I can test those out and see if anything exists there. I did want to talk real briefly. I know I had heard Richard on a couple of podcasts mention that the albino hognose snake was the first one that popped up. And I wanted to give him an opportunity to clarify what he meant with that statement. And I'll let him do it right here, because some of you had said, well, that's a discrepancy between your books, because your book said that the pink pastel was first and then the orange albino came later. And that's the fact. But I'll let you hear it straight from Richard's mouth right here. And then we'll jump back on.
Yeah, this is Richard Evans. I recently have done a couple of podcasts on hognose snakes, and after going through and looking at some of my notes and trying to recreate and look at everything again, I realized I was a little bit confused on some stuff. I just assumed that the first snake I had was the albino hognose, and the second one was the pastel pink. And I know that sounds funny that I got confused on that, but basically what had happened was the very first one I got was indeed the pastel pink albino. And I actually called it an albino until I received the second one. When I got the second one, and it looked more like an albino bull snake, so I realized, okay, this first one is not a regular albino. And that's when I came up with the name. I came up with pastel pink albino for the original one, and then albino for the second one that I had. So there's a little bit of confusion on my part when I was talking on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for clarifying that. I really appreciate that. And hopefully that gives the listeners an opportunity to kind of recognize what was going on. It was really cool. Richard had me come by the pet shop today, and we got to, sit down and visit about all kinds of stuff, covering all kinds of bases. Man, it was just really interesting. It's never quite enough time, but I think the more experiences you have as an individual, the more you have to talk about. So we were talking about different localities and species, not even hognose. We talked about mottled rock rattlesnakes, which can be found about 4 hours away from where we're at right now, and some of the beautiful, looks of those that we had found. Richard mentioned that he had only ever caught one alterna. I'm the same way. Mine was about 40 miles from where his was found. And, kind of once I had broken, through that tape, I really never pursued alterna again, but I definitely, love going after hognose and finding those. Those are just such an amazing thing. So what's in a name? These distinguishments help us to determine between different, a lot of times maybe albeit similar bloodlines or expressions. So we see that a lot with the granite jungle population. I was talking a little bit more in depth with Richard today about the granite jungles. He was asking me about those, if they were related to the jungle. And I said, yeah, I think they're from the same population. The collector that kind of introduced me to the population used to sell to Pets Plus years and years ago. And I started purchasing from him because he just was finding hognose left and right. I've talked about him in my books. He's a friend. He'll remain unnamed for now just because he would prefer it that way. But nonetheless, I believe that his population is where the granite jungles, the Evans jungles all originated. Now, we've learned in recent months that JMG also talked about an animal that was featured in the 2000 edition of Reptiles magazine, and that animal was a jungle, and he talked about how his lemon ghost woma, or at least part of that, came from that original bloodline that Richard promoted, which was phenomenal. I mean, just really cool stuff. If you like that spider, granite jungle, Lemon Ghost Woma, if you like that complex. Gavrith Green's very similar. Dan Eby had a line that was similar for a while. There were a few other bloodlines in captivities like over 20 years ago that were similar. We know the spider was found, spider bloodline, the true spider bloodline that John Lynch promoted, was found about 2 hours north of Lubbock. So it is not a part of that Granite Jungle Woma complex. So something completely different. But those are the distinguishments you make until you figure out what's maybe related or not. Same thing happened with recessive traits, hypo. You've seen Evans hypo, you've seen Dutch hypo. And by the way, I know I've heard some critics say, oh, you know, Richard Evans named his own hypo. Richard never named his own hypo, ever. That came later to distinguish between animals that were produced in Europe called Dutch hypo from the Evans hypo. It was believed that they were two separate lines, but just like a lot of the genetics we've seen in ball pythons that look similar, people think they're totally different, and they end up being exactly the same thing, or they're compatible, allelic, however you want to say. That might be the same situation there. You know, it's really interesting. Probably the mid-2000s, we really saw pink pastel begin to kind of fall off the map. I know there were some issues early on with trying to get those to breed and get going, and there was some interbreeding and inbreeding that was going on with those where they were a little too closely related. They had not had the outcrossing. There were several breeders that really kind of jumped on that and really intended to outcross. I know Joe Schmidt out in Reno, Chad Fuchs, maybe some of the other ones really wanted to see the pastel pink come back around, but they kind of disappeared off the map for a little while. So the older crowd that was used to saying pastel pink and associating or knowing those as albino were, you know, kind of sideswiped by this new crew of folks coming in who only knew the orange albino. So, and I call it the orange albino, and that's kind of where that term came in at, because people would say, which albino are you talking about? Are you talking about the pink one, or are you talking about the orange one? They were using descriptive terms to describe those. So the orange albino, or what I refer to all the time as the orange albino, really didn't get that name, the orange albino, until probably 2005 or 6. I remember there was a breeder, gosh, it seems like they were in maybe Pinellas Pines, Florida, and they were breeding the heck out of albino. That was really when we saw the prices start to decline on those from the $1,500 mark that they held for almost, well, I guess at least a decade. There were so many being produced that the prices started to drop off a little bit, 800, 600, you know, somewhere in there. And that was really where people started just realizing that the orange albino were everywhere. They were being bred into a lot of stuff. They were at that time being bred into reds pretty consistently by a lot of different breeders, even breeders, you know, across the world. BHB and Chad Fuchs were kind of really pushing the snow projects. So those were really starting to get some lift and get off the ground. And like I said, it was very, very hard to come by pink pastel stuff. And those started to show up again kind of alongside the anaconda. Some of you folks know that the first anacondas and anaconda superconda bloodline promoted by Brent started to pop out some nice pink pastels. It wasn't until a couple years later that Brent had the Pink Panther. That was kind of a jump start to the Anaconda project that was really pretty cool, and people were seeing these hidden hets pop out. They were strengthened by that new Anaconda bloodline, and it was just a really neat thing for everybody. But yeah, that term orange albino, just so you have clarity there, that's where it started to surface. Just a distinction between colors, and thankfully within a few years, you had a lot more pink pastels that came up. Now, of interest, and for another topic, another time, a lot of the older bloodlines of pink pastel held true to their origins, and they were bubblegum pink. And some of the animals would turn kind of a beige white as adults, much like the picture of the one you've seen here that I've put on this video. Really, really neat animals. But as they began to be outcrossed, there was just different colors that came in. And so even today, we see pink pastel bloodlines that individuals have distinguished and says this is some of the original bloodlines from long ago, or maybe it's something a little newer. Cool stuff there. Hope you enjoyed this podcast. As always, catch you guys on the flip side.